Welcome, friends. My name is Sandra Berry and I'm Director of Woodbrook. And it gives me great pleasure to be able to welcome you all to the 2017 Swarthmore Lecture. And I hope you can see me beyond the microphones. I want to welcome you all here in this room. I know some of you are listening elsewhere on the campus, and I hope there are those that are listening from all over the world through the live link. There's one person I particularly want to welcome this evening, and we're very grateful that one of our lecturers from last year is able to be with us this evening. And Cecile Nirama, welcome to you. Thank you. The first thing I'd like you to do is to check your mobile phones, your tablets, and anything else that might beep, ring, or play a tune. If you could turn them off, preferably, or alternatively, choose the most silent mode that you can find. And whilst you're doing that, I'll let you know that we're very glad that the book to accompany the lecture will be available outside at the end of this lecture and also in the bookshop for the rest of the week. Before I introduce our lecturer this evening, Katherine West, I hope you might forgive me a small diversion into time travel. As a Quaker learning organisation, Woodbrook came into existence in 1903, and one of the early ways in which the learning was extended to a wider audience was through the Swarthmore Lecture. The first lecture was given in 1908, and the original intention has remained today. The lecture has two key purposes. Firstly, to interpret to Quakers their message and mission, and secondly, to make the wider public aware of the spirit, the aims, and fundamental principles of Friends. The topic, of the lecture and the name of the lecturer are discerned by the Swarthmore Lecture Committee, who are appointed by Woodbrook trustees. And they have quite a challenging time, and one of those times is actually the meeting that happens after the lecture has happened. Because that committee meeting must look at the lecture that has happened in the past. It's looking at the lecture that's going to happen next year, the lecture that's happening the year after, and possibly even the year after that. And so I think we might be fundraising for a Jules Verne time machine or a TARDIS to help them in this. I'm pleased to say that our lecture committee continue to live adventurously. But let us come back to the present. Our lecturer this evening, Katherine West, is Member of Parliament for Hornsey and Wood Green in North London. And prior to her election in Parliament in 2015, Katherine was leader of the London Borough of Islington. Katherine began attending Quaker meetings in 1994, and her local meeting is Muswell Hill. Quaker testimonies inform Katherine's politics, and as a Quaker, she's committed to tackling rampant inequality as one of the most pressing challenges of our time. She believes an unequal society is bad for everybody, harming a nation's well-being and health. Friends, the Swarthmore Lecture is prepared ministry, and so it is our practice not to have questions at the end of the lecture. Instead, we invite you to attend the follow-up session with Katherine tomorrow at 4 o'clock in the Arts Centre Theatre. It is also our practice not to applaud at the end. When Katherine has finished giving the lecture, she will sit down, and we invite you to join us in the silence before we shake hands. Let us now settle into that silence and Katherine will speak when she's ready.
Friends, it's a privilege to address you here tonight as the 110th Swarthmore Lecturer, and I give this lecture in memory of my friend and colleague Jo Cox MP, who was murdered for being who she was whilst doing her job in her constituency last year. Jo and I shared a faith in the power of politics to make the world a fairer, more equal place, and a conviction that we all have more in common than that which drives us apart. And I'm honoured too to follow in the footsteps of Esther Mombo and her colleague Cecile, who's here this evening, whose powerful lecture on Quaker peacebuilding in East Africa I had the pleasure to hear at Britain Yearly meeting last year. In fact, the themes of our two lectures are connected. Esther spoke memorably of healing a divided community, riven by inequality that had turned in on itself, and there is ample evidence to suggest that countries which exhibit high levels of inequality between groups are more likely to experience violent conflict than more equal countries. When inequality gives rise to such conflict, the violence in turn can compound intergroup inequality, creating a vicious cycle. In recent years, inequality between countries may have diminished, but inequality within countries has increased. And for me, one of the reasons to become a Quaker, joining as I did formally in 1998, was the Friends' strong testimony to equality. In my view, tackling rampant inequality is one of the most pressing challenges of our time, and I believe that an unequal society is bad for everybody, harming our nation's well-being and health. Quakers have a strong tradition of addressing the failings they see in the world around them, and I hope to use this evening's lecture to inspire friends to champion the cause of equality in your own communities. Despite market forces and global headwinds, I believe we can all make a difference to our own neighbourhoods, acting as spirit levelers to help create a fairer world. In their best-selling book, The Spirit Level, Professor Richard Wilkinson and Professor Kate Pickett advanced the thesis that inequality is bad for everyone, not just the poor. They show how, as the rich get richer and the divide grows, everybody suffers through social ills, such as higher mortality rates, more suicides, worse mental health, more crime, and more people in prison. The film, which some of you may have seen, The Divide, illustrates powerfully just how arid and isolating an experience it can be for those at the top of an unequal society. Accordingly, reducing inequality benefits everyone, because it isn't just how low the bottom is that matters, but how big the gap between the bottom and the top is. Alleviating absolute poverty is certainly important, but reducing relative poverty matters as well. That a child in Kenya cannot afford shoes is lamentable, but that she should have to watch her peers in their new trainers every single day makes it harder still. It's bad that there is a postcode in the London Borough of Tower Hamlets with the lowest average earnings per resident of anywhere in the country. But what makes it worse is that it's the same postcode that has the highest average earnings per employee that works there, in the gleaming towers of Canary Wharf. As Quakers, we believe that of God in everyone, and in my view, what George Fox meant with these words in 1656 is that every life is both equal and holy. In 1948, the same sentiment found secular expression in the first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. The recent film, The Price of Fairness, showed that children develop a strong sense of fairness, or inequity aversion, as the filmmakers call it, very early on in life. Reading Animal Farm at school, they immediately clock, in George Orwell's allegorical masterpiece, the hypocrisy of the ruling pig's maxim, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. A commitment to fair process is hardwired into us as human beings, and an egalitarian conviction is central to my worldview as a politician in Britain today. However, unfortunately, merely believing that all people are created equal does not make it so. So for me, alongside other Quaker values such as simplicity and sustainability, actively advancing the cause of equality is both a political imperative and a spiritual vocation. And this commitment to social justice has driven me on my Quaker journey, but I still have a very long way to go. My own lived experience has taught me how unequal our society can be, but also how we can, by our actions, redress the inequities we encounter. And for me, the public flows from the personal. My first love was languages. That led me to work for local authorities with asylum seekers, for whom English was not their first language, helping families and young people from war-torn countries gain access to housing, college and healthcare. I became a caseworker for David Lammy MP, working in Weekly Advice Bureau in Tottenham, North London. The stories I heard then are similar to the stories I hear in my own constituency surgeries now. Tales of housing need, money worries, and poor access to secure employment. I wanted then, and I want now, to see politics address the needs of deprived and disadvantaged communities, to tackle the scourge of low pay and the blight of pensioner poverty. David Lammy encouraged me to become a local councillor, drawing on my background as a Sure Start volunteer. Following 8 years as leader of the Labour group on Islington Council, having used our time in opposition to develop a radical manifesto to make the place a fairer place, we won the local elections in 2010 and began work on the Fairness Commission. We knew that the gap between the haves and the have-nots creates a disconnect in our communities. We were motivated by what we believed then and have proven since, namely that with innovative policies and political will, many of these problems can be solved. Many people had analysed inequality. We wanted to own the problem locally and do something about it. Ada Salter, Quaker municipal feminist and pioneer of ethical socialism, is a hero of mine, and her biography is in the bookshop. Please go and buy a copy. She founded the Bermondsey Independent Labour Party in the year in which the first Swarthmore Lecture was given. Later she wrote, "Women can effect a great change in the social life of the metropolis. In the affairs of state is needed the unselfish spirit of the good mother who considers the happiness and well-being of all the members of her household, rather than the aggrandisement of some. Treating people not merely mercifully and humanely, but in the same way as we ourselves would hope to be treated." Her words encapsulate the drive that I and many friends feel to address inequality today. Levels of income inequality in the UK have declined gradually in the past decade, largely because the number of workless households has actually fallen. But they remain significantly higher than they were in the 1960s and 1970s, and are higher than those of our European counterparts. The number of people officially living in relative poverty after housing costs in 2014-15 was 13.5 million, or 21% of our total population. Of these, 3.9 million were children. The Institute for Fiscal Studies predicts that these numbers will increase from this year, and indeed the IFS has projected a 50% increase in relative child poverty between 2014 and 2020. Despite London, where I practice my politics, with its unparalleled agglomeration effect, generating more than a fifth of the nation's income, the proportion of individuals in relative low income after housing costs is actually higher in London than in any other region, owing to that high cost of housing in the capital. And it's for such reasons that Lord Victor Adebowale, chair of the London Fairness Commission, has observed trenchantly that London is a playground for the rich, a treadmill for the middle classes, and a workhouse for the poor. Academics at the London School of Economics have argued that whilst Brexit may not exacerbate inequality within the UK, nor will it reduce it. If anything, the result itself of the EU referendum can be viewed as a response to unfettered inequality and a rejection of those who appeared to defend it. Experts, arguing in 9-digit figures and indecipherable acronyms that British membership of the EU was critical to our economy, failed to appreciate that too many people felt that that same economy was not working for them. But it's when it is viewed globally that inequality is at its starkest. As Oxfam have demonstrated, the richest 1% of the world's population is now richer than the remaining 99% put together. Shockingly, the richest 62 individuals on the planet have the same combined wealth as the bottom half of humanity, comprising 3.6 billion people. The top skyrocketing and the bottom free-falling are not unconnected. As Professors Alan Kruger and Paul Krugman have explained, the higher the levels of inequality in society, the lower the levels of social mobility. That is to say that inequality of outcome hampers equality of opportunity. Thomas Piketty, in his best-selling book Capital in the 21st Century, warns that soaring inequality leads to political instability. And perhaps that's what we're seeing now both here and in the United States. It is worth asking yourself then, what are the differences between equality of opportunity and equality of outcome? It's not only progressive academics, civil society campaigners, trade unionists and social democrats pointing out that inequality has reached dangerous levels. Mark Carney and Andrew Haldane, the Governor and Chief Economist of the Bank of England, have of late criticised levels of inequality in the UK as bad for the UK's economic outlook. Even Christine Lagarde of the International Monetary Fund has said inequality is leading to protectionism with tragic consequences for the global economy. And Gabriela Ramos, Chief of Staff at the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, has declared that inequality is one of the main obstacles to improved global economic performance. Put simply, not only is inequality bad in social terms, it hinders economic growth too. The trickle-down economics that US President Reagan asserted in 1986 have failed. There has been no real increase in US wages in the past 30 years. Profound economic inequality in the form of disparities in income and in wealth is often accompanied by democratic inequality in terms of imbalances of power and voice. Both forms of inequality contribute to, or rather undermine, important human notions of worth, esteem, and respect. So, how politically engaged are you? Politics is essentially concerned with changing the world around us for the better, through dialogue rather than force. It takes two main forms, which are not mutually exclusive, and both of which matter: participatory politics and representative politics. The former may range from online single-issue clicktivism to marching on demonstrations, to membership of a trade union, to organising alongside fellow citizens. The latter tends to mean standing for office or electing others to it. In either incarnation, political activism is a valid route to making change. And Quakers have a rich tradition of such activism. From 19th century American Thomas Garrett campaigning for the abolition of slavery, for example, to 20th century British social reformer Ada Salter, tackling slum housing in the capital as one of the early female councillors and London's first woman mayor. Quakers have fought successfully in Parliament and in their communities for the rights of women, recognition for conscientious objectors, prison reform, offender rehabilitation, conflict resolution, restorative justice, social housing, and support for those suffering from sexual abuse. Quaker leadership has often been by way of example. The Retreat, for instance, founded in 1792 by Yorkshire Quaker William Tuke, was the first establishment in England where mental illness was regarded as something from which a person could recover, and patients were treated with sympathy and respect. More recently, Quakers have been busting the myths that facilitate rampant economic inequality and developing roadmaps to a more equal society. We can and should draw upon this tradition today. In my own experience as a 21st century politician, there's every reason to be optimistic about the difference we as Quakers can make. In seeking inspiration, it's worth asking, which pioneers of equality have a connection with the place where you live or somewhere nearby, and what did they achieve? What I hope we as Quakers can do is help politicians of all parties and the public to see that tackling inequality should be a systemic priority for the government and for civil society. Inequality has risen in recent decades in many democratic countries in the face of very little popular resistance. Despite their achievements in raising the profile of the issue, the 99% and Occupy movements remain outliers. The Nordic model of government, which explicitly seeks to reduce income inequality, remains the exception, confined to Scandinavia rather than the rule. We do need to ask why this is so. Part of the reason may be an excessive credulity when it comes to often self-justifying myths of meritocracy and equality of opportunity, which assume that there's a level playing field and emphasise the notion of deserving or deserts, and a certain denial when it comes to accidents of circumstance. Our society's celebration of success in material terms, developed by the popular media, might also be a contributory factor. A good place for governments to start, in terms of tackling corrosive inequality, would be the closure of the world's tax havens. The recent film, The UK Gold, contends that the global offshore economy comprises approximately £22 trillion of private wealth sitting untaxed, primarily in British overseas territories and Crown dependencies, and in Luxembourg, whilst there is a £25 billion of tax avoidance in the UK every year. Meanwhile, ordinary people like you have to play by a different set of rules and pay the tax that's owed. If established politics, however, fails to address deepening inequality, or worse, is seen to facilitate or endorse it, then we saw in 2016 how populism can rise in response. Put bluntly, many people are fed up with having things done to them and being let down by a system that does not feel as if it was designed for their benefit. The result of the referendum on the UK's membership of the EU and subsequent Brexit, and the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States, are both seismic political ruptures that demonstrate dramatically how on both sides of the Atlantic many people consider established politics to be an elite, distant and disempowering affair to which they cannot relate. We need to address, not dismiss, this profound and prevailing sense of democratic deficit. Politics can give people a stake and a say in the way their society is organised. It can give people a voice. I see it as part of my role to encourage people to re-engage with politics and counter disillusioned detachment. Withdrawal, whether in despair or disdain, simply cedes the political space to forces that would turn us against one another in order to divide and rule, from inflammatory tabloids to racist demagogues. The image which will forever epitomise the problem for me is that photograph of Donald Trump and Nigel Farage together, following the former's election to the presidency, grinning in a gold-plated lift, the people's champions, supposedly standing up for the ordinary man and woman. And yet, as Quakers, perhaps we should strive to find good in everyone and show love in the face of prejudice. And personally, I take inspiration from the example set, for instance, by young Muslim women from the Dialogue Society in Holloway, who in December 2016 headed to Forest Hill Station to give out roses to commuters in the aftermath of a vicious Islamophobic assault. It bears repeating, we have more in common with each other than that which divides us. If we cannot change what's happening on our street, why should anyone believe that we can change the wider world? And politics starts with the local. As Quakers, we should own the challenge of inequality, offering civic leadership in all our communities. That's what I tried to do when I established the Fairness Commission as a council leader in 2010. Despite its wealthy reputation and its surfeit of millionaires, Islington Borough is also home to real deprivation. The borough is both poor and unequal. It was against that backdrop that, together with colleagues, I set up the country's first Fairness Commission to ask how we might tackle poverty and reduce inequality in our part of North London. And in a context of swinging government cuts to the council's budget, residents understood that the Fairness Commission was about trying to make the locality as fair a place as possible. I convened 20 commissioners, including not only councillors of different parties, but also representatives of trade unions, the NHS, the local council, the police, the Chamber of Commerce, academics and more. It was co-chaired by Professor Richard Wilkinson and Councillor Andy Hull. The idea was that it would shape the council's agenda, strategy and budget for the years ahead, and I wanted it both radical and realistic to show that there are things that we can do locally to narrow the gap. The Commission took the shape of a year-long listening exercise. We held 7 public meetings around the borough with 500 attendees. We sought and heard memorable testimony from local residents, including from hard-to-reach groups. I recall a powerful contribution from a drug-using sex worker who recorded an audio piece about her precarious situation and her aspiration for a safer life. A room with 100 people in it sat absolutely silent as that tape played. I remember also a play put on by young people with learning difficulties from the Elfrida Society about their treatment in GP waiting rooms, feeling not listened to but spoken down to instead. Authentic testimony like this is powerful because it closes the gaps between people who walk the same streets but inhabit completely different worlds. We heard evidence too from expert witnesses, both local and national. We invited and received written submissions from over 100 local groups and individuals. And a year later, the Islington Fairness Commission published its final report, Closing the Gap, containing 19 recommendations to make the borough a fairer place by reducing poverty and tackling inequality in the areas that matter most to people's life chances. The Fairness Commission provided the Council with clarity and simplicity of definition. It meant people knew what we were about and what we stood for, and created a brand that served the borough well ever since. And to this day, I am told, applicants for jobs still turn up at interview at Council explaining how they hope to make the borough a fairer place. The Commission put flesh on the bones of our Fairness in Tough Times logo, providing a rationale for the tough decisions we had to make. Most of all, though, it enabled us to exercise influence outside of the immediate authority as a convener and a shaper of a more fair place. Since then, there have been 31 other Fairness Commissions across the UK, Brighton and Hove, Southampton and Plymouth, Newport in Wales, and Shetland, Dundee and Fife in Scotland. In Newcastle, the Fairness Commission coined an approach to local policy making known as fair share, fair play, fair go, fair say. In Sheffield, the Fairness Commission illustrated levels of inequality in the city by charting the journey of the number 83 bus through richer and poorer districts. Most of the Fairness Commissions so far have been convened by the local authority, but others have been set up by the area's MP or the mayor or a local charity, and many have featured an independent chair or sponsor, such as the Archbishop of York. They've secured public participation, raised the profile of inequality in the area, and produced analyses of its nature and extent. There's even been international interest from the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung think tank in Germany. Sadly, it did not attract much central government interest from Westminster or Whitehall. Locally, though, the Fairness Commission was a highly effective and influential piece of work. Might your area benefit from a similar approach? Regardless of the model of change we adopt, sometimes progress will be slow. I find it helpful to imagine the chant, what do we want? Gradual change. When do we want it? In due course. There will also need sometimes to be compromises and pragmatism. Not without reason do they say that politics is the art of the possible. We sometimes have to make trade-offs and prioritise. For instance, when we opened the first new Citizens Advice Bureau in 10 or 15 years in a high-profile, high-street location, we had to close the Green Living Centre temporarily to set up free up the space. Although the CAB now does offer advice on, among other things, fuel poverty and energy costs. To make a real difference, we may well have to attend to detail that we would rather ignore. We may campaign in poetry, but we tend to govern in prose. And we may have to follow some actions up time and again until they actually happen. But all of it's worth it if it means that we can get things done. We live in a rich country that's failing to house its people properly. And housing here is in chronic crisis, with house prices trebling in the decade before the 2008 financial crash. Owning a home is now out of reach for many without access to the bank of mum and dad. If we want to avoid inflating another major economic bubble, a return to self-certified 100% loan-to-value, interest-only and buy-to-let mortgages, that's not the answer. At the same time, government policy is marginalising social housing, which is fast becoming the preserve of only the poorest in society. Each homeowner tends to be richer than the person from whom they buy. Each tenant who moves into a council property tends to be poorer than their predecessor. And these dynamics threaten to segregate our society, with communities divided along housing tenure lines. Often, those on our estates and on our streets barely mix. They have no relationships with one another, and so the gap grows. This fracture was laid bare when Grenfell Tower caught fire, and Kensington and Chelsea Council soon learnt that the worst time to try to talk to someone for the first time is in a time of crisis. More and more people, including increasingly families with children, are being funnelled into a private rented sector that's all too often indecent, unaffordable and insecure. Assured short-hold tenancies offer little by way of notice or security. Over 40% of the private rented sector does not meet the decent home standard, despite the government ploughing £9 billion a year into it in the form of local housing allowance. Private rented accommodation is where many of what Theresa May calls just about managing and what Ed Miliband called the squeezed middle now reside. Tackling inequality in housing would mean once again making social housing a mixed tenure, as opposed to the preserve of the disadvantaged. It would mean a better regulated private rented sector, as some people will always want the flexibility private renting brings. And it would mean making owner occupation more accessible to ordinary families. There is, after all, a democratic argument for increasing home ownership, and a social argument too. People who own their own home enjoy a stability that lends itself to their getting involved in their local community. But none of these developments is likely unless nationwide house building can be dramatically increased. Even if 1 million new homes were built during this Parliament, which seems unlikely now, that would be enough merely to slow but not to stop the widening of the gap between supply and demand. Fixing the problem of housing supply is largely a question of finance, At the moment, 95% of the country's housing expenditure is spent on housing benefit, and only 5% is spent on building new homes. It's not always been this way, and it must not continue as it is. In the late 1970s, 80% of housing spend was on bricks and mortar. We have to shift back from subsidising rents to building homes, from benefits to bricks. In doing so, we must avoid repeating the mistakes of the 1980s when private finance was introduced into social housing with a ghettoising effect, reducing space standards, increasing rents, and denuding housing associations over time of their social purpose. And to move forwards, we may need to decentralise. If the government were to lift the borrowing cap imposed on councils, which prevents them building more council homes, rather than coming up with ever more gimmicks for prospective home buyers, then we might be able to get somewhere. These centrally imposed borrowing restrictions preventing local authorities from leveraging their assets and income make us Europe's odd one out. Public housing expenditure is, after all, an investment. We need to shake up the development industry that has had it too easy and too cosy for too long. The state gives big developers land, money and guarantees and gets too little by way of genuinely affordable housing in return. We should allow failing developers to go to the wall, with local government then acting as a clearinghouse for their land banks. We should insist on rapid build-out and lower profit margins through public land programs, and we should encourage local councils and the mayors of city regions to release more public land for house building in return for equity stakes that secure public benefit. It's also important that housing be developed to cater for the full range of needs in our society. In particular, the needs of older residents could be better met. In researching this evening's lecture, I had the pleasure of meeting with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Housing Trust in York, where there are 10,000 households on the council's housing waiting list. The Trust's main mission is to tackle housing inequality. It invests in the community using a social investment fund of £10 million, according to the Trust's vision of social investment to prevent social ills. Its approach is infused with its Quaker founding philosophy of a long-term perspective, mature attitude towards risk, and deep engagement with the community. The Trust has recently developed a project called New Earswick for All Ages, which has seen significant investment in a settlement for people at different stages of life's journey. Last year, again as part of the research for this lecture, I met a friend called Tony Crofts. Tony's a Quaker who joined the Friends in Oxford in the 1970s, and today he's the founder and director of Abolish Empty Office Buildings in Bristol, where he's in the business of recycling spaces. He's teamed up with Triodos Bank and harnesses ethical investment via a community share offer to buy wasteful, empty commercial properties and convert them into affordable homes, cooperatively run for people who need them. Fellow Quakers have provided the training for tenants to run the co-op. In Bristol alone, where a household needs an income of £70,000 per annum to purchase a flat on the open market, and where the social housing waiting list is 14,000 households long, there are apparently 2.2 million square feet of unused office space. At the end of 2016, Tony and friends unveiled the first 6 units of social housing in what's been disused commercial premises. And what I heard in Bristol is an excellent example of the power there is not only in organised people, but in organised investment too. We also need to support the development of new home share schemes. That's something many of us can do in our local community. Take, for example, the Fair B&B pilot developed by the campaign company off the back of the Croydon Opportunity and Fairness Commission. Its aim is to prevent homelessness before it occurs by matching hosts with spare rooms to families who have fallen on hard times and need a roof over their heads. These kinds of schemes involve a paid coordinator screening and then matching, for instance, an older person who owns their home and has a spare room to offer with a younger person who then becomes, in effect, their lodger. Both parties agree to a code of conduct and sometimes pay a small fee to fund the coordination and administrative support. Often the lodger undertakes to provide a certain number of hours each week of help to the host. Such schemes can be win-win, addressing a manifest need whilst promoting intergenerational interaction. They can also help tackle social isolation among older people, providing support that allows them to remain living independently in the community, even reducing the costs to the NHS, for instance, as a result of fewer falls. But they also enable young people of limited means to find access to secure, decent and affordable accommodation. But lack of supply is not the only driver of inequality in housing. More robust regulation to strike a better deal for those who rent privately would also help. Private landlords should be required to sign up to a national register, just as registered social landlords are. Landlord licensing schemes should be made mandatory so that longer tenancies, for instance with a 5-year secure period and a 5-month notice period, could be developed, and rent stabilisation could be introduced in hotspots, for example in New York, where rents are capped rather than in absolute values. Legislation that currently allows minimal furnishing of a home to class it as occupied for tax avoidance purposes could also be tightened to address the buy-to-leave phenomenon prevalent in many parts of London. If we all did that when it comes to housing, then reform and resources would enable housing supply to meet demand. Home ownership would become more affordable to more people. Social housing would become more mixed and mainstreamed. Private renting would be better quality and more secure. More people could enjoy a stable, decent, ample and affordable home, and housing could be a force for integration and equality in our society. Could you address inequality in housing where you live? If the housing market can compound inequality in the UK, the job market can drive it. But it would be an error and a mistake to try to divide the population of the UK crudely into skivers and strivers. As Professor Sir John Hills argues in his book Good Times, Bad Times, the welfare myth of them and us is such a simplistic dichotomy which is inaccurate and unhelpful. At different stages in our lives, whether we realise it or not, we all benefit from the welfare state and the social security it affords us. There's no doubt, however, that if we are to unlock the most pressing socio-economic problems in many of our communities, then employment is one of the keys. Many of you will work in organisations that can make a contribution in this area by providing employment opportunities for local people. This could include forging links with local schools, offering careers advice, coaching, mentoring and work experience. A high-quality summer volunteering scheme can make all the difference. Businesses can offer apprenticeships, paid internships and traineeships. Employers can practice anonymous shortlisting and recruitment to avoid inadvertent discrimination. They can ensure their premises are fully accessible for disabled people. They can offer flexible job share and part-time work to fit in with people's caring responsibilities and support for childcare, such as childcare loans. They can ensure employee representation on any remuneration board and recognise trade unions. And they can insist that throughout their supply chain, their suppliers do some of this as well. The Fairness Commission we ran recommended all of this. Do you think the organisation where you work does some of it? Or maybe could you help your organisation to do some of it? Getting a job is really important, but in-work poverty also remains a real feature of Britain today. An irresponsible form of capitalism typified by the hoarding of profit and the sharing of loss has led us on a wages race to the bottom. Companies have got away with it because they've been propped up by corporate welfare. Big retailers currently pay many of their shop floor staff poverty wages, safe in the knowledge that through mechanisms such as tax credits and housing benefit, the government will effectively bail firms out. A prerequisite of any sustainable industrial strategy for the future must be a resolute rejection of poverty pay. Every Fairness Commission held so far has identified income inequality as a major challenge, and most of them have recommended as a measure to address it local implementation of the annually uprated and real living wage of £9.75 per hour in London and £8.45 per hour out of London, which is independently calculated based on the actual cost of living. There's a clear need for such action, given more than 1 in 5 UK workers, over 5 million people, now earns less than the living wage. The living wage is about money, yes, but it's also about ideas, not just surviving, a wage, not a handout, earning, contribution and reciprocity, and the dignity of work. When it's won not by someone in Whitehall pulling a lever, but by workers themselves campaigning in the workplace, it can be about politics done with people, not just for people. The living wage is important for employees, employers and society as a whole. It means quitting that second job or getting some sleep, catching 1 tube to work instead of 2 buses, buying Christmas presents this year, having a family holiday and spending some time with the kids. For employers, it means higher staff morale, improved rates of retention, lower rates of sickness and absence, and reputational gain. And for society, it's important that no one should have to do a hard day's work for less than they can live on. By working, people ought to be able to earn their keep, as well as enjoy some quality time with friends and family. Locally, urging employers to pay their staff and contractors the living wage was the top recommendation of our Fairness Commission's final report. In 2012, the Council became the UK's first accredited living wage local authority, securing the living wage for all of its 5,000 directly employed staff. In 2013, the Council reviewed all of its contracts and built a living wage requirement into its £500 million per annum procurement activity, securing the living wage for 92% of its contractors. In 2014, this figure climbed to 98% as the local authority secured the living wage for all 519 of its home care workers, including for their travel time between appointments. In 2015, the Council secured the living wage for workers at one of its residential care homes and became the first public sector body to be accredited as a living wage-friendly funder, building a living wage requirement into its core grant giving to charities. The Council's challenge remains the rest of its contracted residential social care workforce, who constitute the remaining 2% of its contractors who still do not as yet receive the living wage. Cracking this is far from easy. Adult social care is an industry in which the dominant business model is predicated on low pay, where overall costs are predominantly made up of staff wages, and where private providers operate minimal margins. When the contractors enjoy lengthy contracts and also own the particular care home in question, renegotiating pay is extremely hard. However, throughout all of that time, the Council sought to offer civic leadership by exerting influence outside its immediate remit, convincing other employers in the borough to pay their staff the living wage as well. This approach proved successful with employers across the public sector, such as the London Metropolitan University and over 15 schools, the voluntary sector, some big businesses and some small firms. As a result, the local authority had 110 accredited living wage employers. There's still more to do, and with certain large employers, such as Arsenal Football Club, still not now paying, for instance, their legion of match day caterers the living wage. Finally, Islington Council's £1 billion pension fund has engaged in shareholder activism, lobbying the FTSE 100 companies such as Sainsbury's to go living wage at their AGMs, with limited success. Quakers are already doing excellent work on fairer pay. I met Anne Morgan from Lancaster to hear about her work on the living wage. She had attended a session entitled "Food Banks Are Not Enough" at a Quaker conference in October 2014, put on by Central England. Anne started a small local group to campaign on the living wage and met with her local MP, Cat Smith. The local meeting agreed to run a stall at Christmas 2014, and 3 people agreed to help. Their campaign grew and grew, and ahead of the 2015 general election developed into a local Quaker Equality Week. Anne and her crew have since gone on to lead a national Quaker living wage campaign with a committee of 6. They devised a support pack for other meetings. In the pack there are suggestions of what groups can do, such as pushing local authorities and universities to accredit as living wage employers, lobbying the directors of the cooperative group, or mounting a vigil during the Edinburgh Festival. The theme of this Britain Yearly meeting is movement building, and people like Anne and her committee are doing just that. York Area Quaker Meeting is now accredited as a living wage employer. Other meetings are applying too. It's a slow but thorough process which has thrown up some interesting questions, including around employment law. For instance, regarding wardens' modes of remuneration. The Britain Yearly Meeting and Friends House Hospitality Limited in Euston are both accredited living wage employers, as are Quaker Social Action, Quaker Service in Northern Ireland, and Area Quaker Meetings in Lancaster Central and North, Manchester and Warrington and Mid-Thames. Bootham School is on its way to becoming a living wage employer. Woodbrook Quaker Study Centre does pay the living wage and is working towards accreditation. Other Quaker centres are investigating the possibility of becoming living wage employers, such as Glenthorne and Claridge House. There are sample living wage letters on the website so that friends can write to employers to urge them to do the right thing. I was really impressed by this example of civil society forging a fairer society itself, rather than looking always to statutory authorities to do so. It was also a useful reminder for me that Quakers themselves are, of course, employers and business people and can make a real difference in such capacities in their place of work. So, who are the big employers in your local area? Are they accredited living wage organisations? And if not, what might you do about it? In my experience, there's rarely opposition to reducing poverty at the bottom of the income distribution, levelling up. But the same cannot be said of attempts to close the gap by leaning on those at the top of the income distribution, levelling down. When I increased the pay of our cleaners as council leader, no one argued. But when I stated my intention to finance it by cutting the pay of the role of the chief executive by £50,000, a chorus of naysayers erupted to tell me how we would never be able to find a good CEO again. Some of these people were recruitment consultants with a vested interest, that is, a potential percentage commission in the highest salary possible. Needless to say, having cut the post's pay from $210,000 to $160,000 per annum, we drew an excellent field of candidates and found a first-rate chief exec. If we are to tackle inequality and not just poverty, then we need to be prepared both to level up and level down. With that in mind, on income inequality and pay, the government should require all employers to publish their internal pay ratios between their highest and lowest paid, as opposed to average paid employees, bringing much-needed transparency to the low pay versus high pay debate. The commentator Will Hutton previously suggested that under normal circumstances, no public sector employer should exhibit an internal pay ratio higher than 1 to 20. Islington Council, after we introduced the real London living wage at the bottom of our pay scale, whilst cutting the salary of the chief exec at the top, now has a pay ratio of 1 to 9. For context, in the cooperative group, for example, the pay ratio stands at 1 to 47. The ratio at Friends House in London is narrow at 1 to 4. That of Britain Yearly Meeting as a whole is 1 to 5. At Woodbrook Quaker Study Centre, it's 1 to 3. The Islington Fairness Commission recommended major local employers should all publish their pay ratios in the hope that transparency would bring scrutiny and, in time, progress. If the gap matters, as I believe it does, we have to challenge the idea that dramatic pay inequality is all right and that pay restraint is unnecessary at the top. The most divisive inequalities are those that are evident from an early age. And that's why it's important that tackling child poverty remain high on the national political agenda, and it's why the Fairness Commission put heavy emphasis on the need to prioritise measures that would help address inequality in childhood. Many of the Fairness Commissions to date have identified a lack of accessible, affordable childcare as an issue. In Islington, the first 21 Months project was recommended by the Commission and then established with local health partners to ensure support was available for every child, right through from gestation through the first year of life. Such help ranged from peer support commissioned from the voluntary sector for mothers struggling with breastfeeding, through enhanced health visiting for families, to intensive intervention from family support workers. When Sure Start children's centres were closing in most parts of the country, the council kept all of its open, despite relentless government cuts. A childcare coalition was formed, again a commission recommendation, to make sure the childcare on offer across the borough met modern parents' needs, building in maximum flexibility, making as much of it as possible free, and keeping any unavoidable costs low and transparent. The council introduced free school meals for all primary school children up to year 6, that's age 11, to address both health-orientated and educational outcomes. This has reduced stigmatising division between classmates and meant that each child has a hot, nutritious meal every day, enabling him or her to concentrate in order to learn and preventing them from overdosing on sugar and disrupting the learning of their peers. Moreover, it has meant kids are learning to eat with a knife and fork, to speak to adults at mealtimes, and also saving hard-working families some much-needed cash. If the government were to roll this policy out nationally for all children up to the age of 11, it would be a very effective public health intervention and would also provide much more money for local schools through the Pupil Premium Programme. The Fairness Commission also flagged up the challenges we face when it comes to levels of literacy, and to address these, the Commission recommended and mounted a major drive called Islington Reads, which seeks to raise aspiration and achievement in children and young people through the promotion of reading. The prioritisation of young people also led to the creation of a youth council. The youth councillors, elected by their peers in schools throughout the borough, come from a wide array of backgrounds and participate in youth elections more than adults participate in local elections. By their own admission, they're not all goody two-shoes, but they do help inform decisions made locally about the services which young people use. We also decided to part replace the Educational Maintenance Allowance grant of up to £30 a week for teenagers in further education, which the government had cut. We thought it was important to enable young people to afford to go to college. Budgets were tight at the council. They're even tighter now. But we felt that was a very important priority to make. Ask yourself, how real is equality of opportunity for young people in your area? And what can you do to level the playing field? All of this matters for me, not just because economic equality is important as an end in itself, although undoubtedly that's true, but because it also is a critical means. It's a means to a healthier society, characterised by greater respect and less anxiety. More equal societies are not just more productive, they're happier, have lower levels of depression and suicide, show fewer signs of status competition, and exhibit more peaceful psychology. A world that's more equal economically would be a world that's spiritually more in tune too. I believe you and I can help bring about a world like that. Quakers over centuries have acted on this same conviction, and I hope, after this evening's lecture, you will feel empowered to inspire your local meeting.